This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian Communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today we will be reading from our theoretical magazines Comunismo and La Gauche Communiste, Part 1 of Communist Revolution and the Emancipation of Women from the years 1979 and 1981. Parts 2 through 4 will be released in subsequent videos. Introduction, 1981. During the events of 1952, which we characterized at the time as bird-brained, the magazine Prometeo and the newspaper Battaglia Comunista, the standard-bearers of the left, were torn from our hands. We had to concentrate all our efforts on the newspaper, which was transformed into a new magazine, Il Programma Comunista. As a result of some more recent events, which in order to be always bird-brained were more debased, was also removed from our hands, Il Programma, which for 20 years had represented the programmatic and theoretical continuity from the left. During these 2 decades, a colossal work, both in quality and quantity, was produced by the small party, which can be compared with a just communist pride to that of the Bolsheviks. It is with another press organ, Il Partito Comunista, and with smaller forces that we had to continue the constant battle on all fronts with a specific intention to maintain the small party on the revolutionary road, even if it had become smaller as a result of the dirty split, to quote Lenin, of November 1973. To continue the duty of international diffusion of the revolutionary doctrine that has already been accomplished in France by the periodicals Programme Communiste and Le Prolétaire before they suffer the fate of Programme, we resume with this issue the publication in French of the Theoretical Review of the Party, which, by its very name, wants to claim unquestionable perfect continuity with the monolithic Marxist program, a continuity of struggle which, since the degeneration of the Third International, can be traced back only by taking up the tradition of positions and theses supported by the communist left. It seems essential to repeat that the journal will not contain signed articles and texts, according to the bourgeois model. Even if it is the necessary reprinting of our old and our latest party texts, this cannot satisfy the ambitions of an author. Even the enemies of communism and above all the treacherous parties, who believed they had freed themselves from the necessary theoretical work, must settle their scores with the principles, the purpose, and the program, even if it is to deny them. We consider it a communist victory at the theoretical and doctrinal level that these dirty parties, which dare to call themselves with the glorious names communist and socialist, should be forced to abandon even the Marxist lexicon and express themselves with the vulgar and indecent vocabulary of the bourgeois classes, typical of the petty bourgeois academic intelligentsia, reduced to skepticism and possibilism, which reflects its constant availability to howl with the wolves. We claim as a victory of our revolutionary school that the most obscurantist forces of this capitalist society, like the Catholic Church, under the inescapable pressure of economic, social, and political contradictions, which are powerful accelerators of the dissolution of the present society, in anticipation of the rebirth of the conditions of a new revolutionary assault of the international proletariat, will resume with intransigence and determination their anti-proletarian, anti-communist, and anti-revolutionary doctrines, and the possessing classes will utilize them to defend the values behind which their privileged class interests hide. But theory is a weapon, and it is also a weapon for our enemies. It is an instrument of war, not of arbitration between classes. Revolutionary Marxism is the doctrine of the proletariat, not that of other classes. Still less that of undifferentiated humanity. It is a special doctrine, at the same time passion and science. It is the past, the present, and the future of humanity that lives. It is communism. The following text and the title given to it do not call for further comment. One could not propose only an essay on the millennial oppression of women in class societies, because the oppression of women can be solved only in classless and stateless society, by communism. This is how we propose to the reader a text written by several authors of different ages, who, in the historical arc of more than a century, represents the organic and univocal interpretation of the feminine question, according to the tradition of and the method of revolutionary Marxism, invariant in time and space, until the day where there will no longer be a single woman crushed by the double oppression to which the regime of private property subjects her. It is the demonstration that we have nothing to invent, to discover, to propose on the question that the general theory of the proletarian class does not already know. But it must be emphasized that this theoretical and historical knowledge, although necessary at first, is not enough, and would be reduced to purely academic remarks if we were not to draw indications of struggle, of program, and of political action to translate this dialectic of knowledge into an operational and dynamic dialectic, into a tactical party action. The events of the last 50 years highlight the forms and means imagined by the different bourgeois, democratic, fascist, and then again democratic regimes to perpetuate this ancestral oppression in our capitalist and of private property society. In essence, the so-called recognition of the parity of the two sexes is, in the best of cases, to tend towards an equal economic and social exploitation of the working man and the working woman. To the oppression of woman as a woman is added for the proletarian woman the oppression of wage labor, which transforms more and more, so to speak, the woman into man. If wage labor constitutes the aggravation of female exploitation, it is dialectically the condition of the real liberation, that is, the social liberation of women, of all women. The capitalist transformation of the economy offers women the social and political means to emancipate them through the revolutionary struggle of the proletarian class for communism. It is this fundamental and primordial meaning that this text intends to demonstrate and propose. Some have thought it right, in the purest opportunist style, to cleverly maneuver into the ranks of the organizations of feminism, to the point of endorsing hypocritical little reforms, making it seem a communist maneuver just because it was proposed by so-called communists. It is not to forget that one ceases to be communist from the moment one does not behave as a communist. The class political party, with all the limitations imposed on it today by circumstances, made difficult by a vast and vigorous redeployment of forces, is telling women to demand their total social liberation. The demand of proletarian women, today, are not legal recognition, just to grant them titles of property, which interest only the bourgeois woman, but material conquests, the strength of which rests in all case in the use of methods and organization of the struggle of the working class and in the class mobilization. The most shameful and lamentable aspect is given to us by the former communist parties, which have become national and counter-revolutionary since they have passed into the camp of the defense of the bourgeois state. These parties make every effort to preserve the bourgeois family institution, calling it democratic. An adjective was enough to solve the problem. The democratic family opposing the traditional family, where the woman is democratically enslaved. To the woman, the bourgeois world would offer the same false solution that was imposed on the working class, the democratic dictatorship of capital instead of the fascist dictatorship. The emancipation of women necessarily passes through their association with the struggle of the exploited. The cause of the liberation of the female sex is indefensible if it is isolated from that of the destruction of any form of private property over the means of production and distribution, without the conscious and voluntary participation of women in the organization and realization of the collective life, without communism. On the contrary, bourgeois feminism foresees and works for the solidarity of the proletarian woman with the bourgeoisie, excludes a priori the appeal to the methods of the class struggle, and gives the illusion to oppressed women that it is possible outside the class struggle to achieve, with the sole mobilization of women against men, rights and social equality, which in this society are only enjoyable by the cramped minorities of women of the upper middle class, including an intellectual minority, which rise to the level of men of their own class, thanks precisely to the exploitation and degradation of the great mass of women. Any concession to feminist ideology results in the strengthening of the chains with which the current regime binds the vast majority of women. Without the mobilization of women fighting for communism, the clash against capitalism is impossible, and victory impossible, without the social and individual liberation of women. All steps forward towards communism, for women as for men, go through the destruction of the oppression of one sex by the other, because the oppression of one sex brutalizes even more and makes conservative the other. It is the opportunist parties of the democratic bourgeois regime that are today the main obstacle to women's engagement. By fighting against these parties, and therefore against the current regime, women are given the opportunity to choose their side in the social struggle, in the conquest of true political emancipation, in the sense that it is necessary to associate their struggle with perspectives of the Revolutionary Communist Party, in view of the final struggle against the capitalist system, for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the destruction of its state, for the seizure of power by the proletariat and the dictatorship of the proletariat, with a view to abolishing capitalist relations of production and the transition to communism. This is a text of struggle, a war cry against an enemy world. It is a text that only the party of the class can spread, and not only to the proletariat, but to all the oppressed of this ignoble society. It is an undemocratic and anti-capitalist call that comes from the program of the communist left, a complex vision of the general upheaval toward the future society. 1. Origins of the Slavery of Women. August Bebel, Woman and Socialism, 1892. We are living in an age of great social transformations that are steadily progressing. In all strata of society, we perceive an unsettled state of mind and an increasing restlessness, denoting a marked tendency toward profound and radical changes. Many questions have arisen and are being discussed with growing interest in ever-widening circles. One of the most important of these questions, and one that is constantly coming into greater prominence, is the woman question. The woman question deals with the position that the woman should hold in our social organism, and seeks to determine how she can best develop her powers and her abilities in order to become a useful member of human society, endowed with equal rights and serving society according to her best capacity. From our point of view, this question coincides with that other question. In what manner should society be organized to abolish oppression, exploitation, misery, and need, and to bring about the physical and mental welfare of individuals and of society as a whole? It is the common lot of woman and worker to be oppressed. The forms of oppression have differed in successive ages and in various countries, but the oppression itself remained. During the course of historic development, the oppressed ones have frequently recognized their oppression, and this recognition has led to an amelioration of their condition. But whatever similarities exist between the position of the woman and that of the working man, the woman has one precedence over the working man. She is the first human being which came into servitude. Women were slaves before slavery. All social dependence and oppression is rooted in the economic dependence of the oppressed upon the oppressor. The woman has been in this position since an early stage. The oppressed needs someone to animate and inspire him, because he lacks the initiative for independence. It was thus in the present-day movement of the proletariat, and it is the same in the struggle for the emancipation of women. 50th Jubilee Edition, New York, Socialist Literature, 1910, 3, 9-10, 76. Here it is a very important first Marxist statement. Even in the struggle for the emancipation of women, as well as in the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat, the awareness of this necessity is brought to the oppressed from outside, that is, from the class party. It is the party that must make all the demands of this emancipation clear and organize the practical action necessary for this purpose in order to develop in the mass of the oppressed women the awareness of the necessity of the struggle. To justify this party position, it is necessary to go back to the origins of the oppression of women, that is to say, to the beginning of the division into classes of society. The first division of society into classes. When is the woman question born? With the end of the tribal community and the beginning of the monogamous family, the basis of private property. With the monogamous family begins the period of original accumulation of the means of production and of wealth. The family will be a true productive unit that will imply the total slavery of women, of all women. It was not a gradual development, according to a painless evolution, from the primitive community to the monogamous family, but of a real overpowering of a part of the people, i.e. men, that subdues another part of the people, i.e. women. All those who were overwhelmed by private property, whose necessary emergence resulted in the destruction of communistic forms of life. In the primitive community, women were socially equal to men. There existed only a division of functions that did not give rise to the domination of one sex over the other, because all the activities, of man and woman, were social functions and enjoyed the same consideration within the community. It is no coincidence that the children were recognized only by maternal procreation. Since there was no capital or any other form of private property to be transmitted, only the woman was recognized as she gave birth to them. Therefore, the goal of the primitive community in the sexual field was linked solely to the natural function of reproduction of the species and not to the private property of the male over the female and the hereditary children. In Woman and Socialism, Bebel writes, Morgan expresses himself on this phenomenon in the following manner. The family is the active element. It is never stationary, but progresses from a lower to a higher form. The study of primeval history leaves no doubt as to the entirely different relation of the sexes at an early period of human development from their present relation. And when viewed in the light of our present-day conceptions, they seem a monstrosity, a mire of immorality. But as each stage in social development has its own methods of production, thus each stage also has its own code of morals, which is only a reflection of its social conditions. Morals are determined by custom, and customs correspond to the innermost nature, that is, to the social necessities of any given period. Morgan arrives at the conclusion that in the lowest stage of savagery, unrestricted sexual intercourse existed within the tribe, so that all women belonged to all the men, and all the men belonged to all the women. That is, a condition of promiscuity. Wherever a woman has several husbands, it becomes impossible to determine paternity. Paternity becomes a mere fiction. Even at present, with the institution of monogamous marriage, paternity, as Goethe said in his Apprenticeship, depends upon good faith. But if paternity is dubious in monogamous marriage even, it is surely beyond the possibility of determination where polyandry prevails. Only descent from the mother can be shown clearly and undeniably. At that time, matrimonium was spoken instead of patrimonium, mater familias was said instead of pater familias, and one's native country was referred to as the motherland. Just as the earlier family forms, the gens was founded on the common ownership of property. That is, it was a communistic form of society. Woman was the leader and ruler in this kinship organization and was highly respected, her opinion counting for much in the household as well as in the affairs of the tribe. She is peacemaker and judge, and discharges the duties of religious worship as priestess. Woman is invulnerable. Matricide is deemed the most dreadful crime that calls upon all men for vengeance. It is a common duty of all men in the tribe to avenge an injury inflicted upon any member of their kinship by a member of any other tribe. Defense of the woman incites the men to highest bravery. Thus the influence of the matriarchy was perceived in all social relations of the ancient peoples, among the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Greeks before the heroic age, the Italic tribes before the founding of Rome, the Scythians, the Gauls, the Iberians, the Cantabrians, the Germans, and others. At that time, woman held a position in society as she has never held since. Ibid. 16-17, 20, 24-25. Promiscuity and matriarchy are therefore the form of the first human communities, fundamental historical proofs that the first aggregation of men did not know political and social hierarchies, such as the current state and family, but only a division of organic natural functions, which to develop they did not need antagonistic or sexual discrimination, or kinship, or age. This is to reiterate that the current social and political structure, which the bourgeoisie poses for eternity because it would be an expression of the natural way of life of humanity, is not but the consequence of the division into classes of society on the basis of private property. The subordination of women in class societies. 100 years later, the communist left will reconfirm the analysis and judgment given by the Marxists of the time on the primitive community, that was itself at a lowest level only referred to the development of productive forces, but at a level many times higher than the current social relations for the degree of humanity it expressed. Here we report excerpts from the work of the left on 1959, known as Degradation of the Man and of the Woman, in commentary on the manuscripts of 1844, Il Programma Comunista, 1959. In quoting these passages, it is sometimes necessary to use the word man, sometimes the word male, because the first expression indicates all the members of the species, of both sexes. There is no point in using the word, harsh in Italian, femmina. When half a century ago an investigation was made into feminism, a miserable bourgeois deviation of the atrocious submission of women in class society, the eminent Marxist Filippo Turati answered with these words only: "The woman is a man." He meant, she will be such in communism, but for your bourgeois society, she is an animal, an object. In the relationship of the male with the woman, servant and prey of voluptuousness, of the male and also of his own, one finds expressed the infinite degradation in which the man lives himself, in today's society whatever his sex, because of the mystery of this relationship, from man to man, that is to bourgeois society, finds its non-ambiguous, indisputable, exhibited, unveiled expression in the relationship between the male and the woman, and in the way in which it is understood, in today's general opinion, such a relationship that is the immediate and natural one of the life of the species. The immediate, natural, necessary relationship of a man with a man is the relationship of a man with a woman. From the character of this relationship, in the various historical forms it means the text, it follows to what extent man has understood himself as a generic being, as man, the formula that man has the right to such a name only from the historical moment in which he no longer lives as an individual man and for his individual, but as and for the gender, including all his fellow human beings. Primitive communism. This form is claimed in all Marxist literature and in fundamental pages of Marx and Engels, who did not exclude the necessity that between that ancient communism and the communism for which the modern proletariat struggles, forms have followed that arose with private property, class relations, and the tradition of their overlapping cultures. A frank glorification of that first form is in the pages of Capital and the origin of the family, private property, and the state. In the coherence of all our doctrine, we can well describe that primordial form in the light of the sexual structure. There we will find the great light of matriarchy, in which the woman, the Blessed Mother, directs her males and children, the first great form of natural power in the true sense, in which the woman is active and not passive, mistress and not slave. The tradition remains in the Latin family. While the term family comes from famulus, slave, the term woman comes from domina, mistress. In the first communism, rough, yes, but not proprietary nor pecuniary, the form love is much higher than at the time of the legendary rats of women by the Romans. It is not the male who conquers the woman object, but the mother, whom we do not want to call female, who elects their male for the task, transmitted to her, in a natural and human form, of spreading the species. Bebel meticulously studies the slow process through which the destruction of the gens will be determined, and the replacement of it by the monogamous family, a description that is impossible to report here for obvious reasons of space. We refer the reader to the impeccable document represented by the original text, limiting ourselves to a few references in addition to a quotation from Engels, which allow us to highlight the radical change that the relationship between men, and especially the position of the woman, underwent at the end of this process. The division of labor and the growing demands for tools, implements, weapons, etc., led to a development of handicraft along distinct lines apart from agriculture. A special class of craftsmen arose, whose interests in regard to the ownership and inheritance of property diverged considerably from those of the agricultural class. With the breaking up of the old Gentile organization, the power and influence of woman rapidly declined. The matriarchy disappeared and the patriarchate took its place. Man, being an owner of private property, had an interest in having legitimate children to whom he could will his property, and he, therefore, forced upon woman the prohibition of intercourse with other men. The matriarchy implied communism and equality of all. The rise of the patriarchate implied the rule of private property and the subjugation and enslavement of woman. Bebel, 30-33. Engels expands on this thesis in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Thus, monogamy does not by any means make its appearance in history as the reconciliation of man and woman, still less as the highest form of such a reconciliation. On the contrary, it appears as the subjection of one sex by the other, as the proclamation of a conflict between the sexes hitherto unknown throughout preceding history. In an old unpublished manuscript, the work of Marx and myself in 1846, I find the following. The first division of labor is that between man and woman for child-breeding, and today I can add, the first class antithesis which appears in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage, and the first class oppression with that of the female sex by the male. Monogamy was a great historical advance, but at the same time it inaugurated, along with slavery and private wealth, that epoch, surviving to this day, in which every advance is likewise a relative regression, in which the well-being and development of some are attained through the misery and repression of others. It is a cellular form of civilized society, in which we can already study the nature of the antitheses and contradictions which develop fully in the latter. Marx and Engels, Collected Works, 1990. Volume 26, 173 to 174. Engels also says that, in the family, the man is the bourgeoisie, the wife represents the proletariat. Ibid. 181. Babel also describes some consequences of the advent of monogamy and inheritance law, which is interesting not only as documentation of what happened then, but for what it still represents, namely the oppressive life of millions of women, prostitution, subordination to the double morality that leads to the spiritual and sexual segregation of women in the face of brazen libertine behavior of men, the minor rights of illegitimate children towards whom certain current laws have gone in favor, but certainly not the entire social structure, etc. At this period, woman's freedom has come to an end. When she leaves the house, she must veil her face, not to waken the desires of some other man. In the Oriental countries where sexual passions are stronger as a result of the hot climate, this method of isolation is still carried to the extreme. Among the ancients, Athens served as a pattern of the new order. The woman shares the man's bed, but not his table. She does not address him by his name, but calls him master. She is his servant. She was not allowed to appear in public anywhere, and when walking upon the streets she was always veiled and plainly dressed. When she committed adultery she was, according to Solon's law, condemned to pay for her sin either with her life or with her liberty. Her husband was entitled to sell her as a slave. Very different was the man's lot. While the man compelled the woman to abstain absolutely from relations with other men, for the purpose of ensuring the legitimacy of his heirs, he was not inclined to abstain from relations with other women. Courtesanship developed. Women noted for their beauty and intellect, usually foreigners, preferred a free life and the most intimate association with men to the slavery of marriage. Regardless of the question of whether woman is oppressed as a proletarian, we must recognize that in this world of private property, she is oppressed as a sex being. On all sides she is hemmed in by restrictions and obstacles unknown to the man. Many things a man may do, she is prohibited from doing. Many social rights and privileges enjoyed by him are considered a fault or a crime in her case. She suffers both socially and as a sex being. It is hard to say in which respect she suffers more. According to Kant's conception, man and woman together constitute the perfect human being. Upon a normal union of the sexes, the healthy development of mankind depends. Satisfaction of the sexual impulse is essential to the sound physical and mental development of both man and woman. But man has gone beyond the animal stage, and so is not content by the mere physical satisfaction of his sexual impulse. He requires intellectual attraction as well, and the existence of a certain harmony between himself and the person with whom he enters into union. Where such intellectual harmony fails to exist, the sexual intercourse is purely mechanical, and thereby becomes immoral. Men and women of refinement demand a mutual attraction that extends beyond their sexual relations. Marriage is considered by most women as a kind of employment agency, where they must enter at any cost. Conversely, even a large number of men consider marriage only from the business point of view, and all the advantages and damages are carefully calculated and weighed only from a material point of view. Thus it follows that modern marriage is very far from achieving its purpose, and therefore cannot be considered neither holy nor moral. In the decadent Roman Empire, an attempt was made to promote marriages and births by means of state awards. In the Germanic Empire, which is under a corrupt empire such that of the Caesars, attempts were made to collectively prevent the resolution of numerous marriages. The result will be the same here as there. There are thus beings who remain chained together against their will for the rest of their lives. One side becomes the slave of the other, and is forced to suffer the most intimate embraces and caresses for matrimonial duty. Caresses and couplings that she may perhaps abhor even more than insults and bad treatment. Mantegazza, Paolo M., The Physiology of Love, says well, "There is no greater torture than that which forces a human being to let himself be caressed by a person he does not love." Is such marriage not worse than prostitution? Even the prostitute has a certain degree of liberty of withdrawing from her abominable trade, and if she is not the inmate of a public brothel, she may refuse herself to a man she does not wish for some reason or other. But a woman sold in marriage must endure the embraces of her husband, even though she has 100 reasons to hate and despise him. If the marriage has been contracted from the outset and by mutual understanding, as a mere marriage of convenience, matters are not quite as bad. Mutual obligations are considered, and a bearable mode of life is found. Scandal is avoided, especially out of consideration for the children, where such exist. And yet it must be said that the children are the ones to suffer most when their parents lead a cold, indifferent life, devoid of love, even if it does not deteriorate into a life of open hostility. More frequently yet an agreement is accomplished to avoid material loss. The woman is far less inclined to go astray, firstly because psychological reasons make a transgression much more dangerous in her case, and secondly, because when she is the one to break the marital vow, it is considered a crime that society will not condone. As a rule, women will seek divorce only in cases of flagrant infidelity or gross ill treatment, because they are in a dependent position and are obliged to regard marriage as a means of subsistence. Babel, 38, 39, 95, 104 to 105, 106, 118 to 119. No contrast between the prostitute and the legitimate wife. Again, in Woman and Socialism, marriage constitutes one phase of the sex relations of bourgeois society. Prostitution constitutes the other. If men fail to find satisfaction in marriage, they, as a rule, seek it with prostitution. And those men who for one reason or another refrain from marrying seek satisfaction with prostitutes also. To those men, then, who voluntarily or involuntarily lead an unmarried life, and to those who do not find their expectations realized in marriage, opportunities for satisfaction of their sexual impulse are far more favorable than to women. Men have always regarded it as their just privilege to employ prostitution, but they are relentless in condemning a woman who is not a prostitute when she has fallen. Abusing their status as masters, they force them to suffocate their strongest instincts and make their social reputation in marriage dependent on their chastity. The dependence of the woman on the man cannot be expressed in a more drastic way than through this diversity of concepts and judgments about the satisfaction of one and the same instinct depending on the sex. For the bachelor, the conditions are particularly favorable. Nature only signals in women the consequence of the generative act. The man, beyond pleasure, does not have any penis or run any risk. Prostitution thus becomes a necessary social institution of bourgeois society, just as the police, the standing army, the church, and the capitalist class. Ibid. 174. Babel expands on this by discussing the opinion of a number of contemporary physicians on the public health implications of prostitution, particularly W.O. Facke, from whose article Die Prostitution in ethische und sanitäre Bezeichnung, Prostitution in its ethical and sanitary aspects, Babel quotes, "He regards prostitution as a necessary corollary of our civilization. He fears an overproduction of human beings if all persons should marry after having attained maturity, and therefore considers it important that prostitution should be regulated by the state. The Christian state admits that marriage is insufficient and that the man is justified in seeking illegitimate satisfaction of the sexual impulse. The woman is taken into consideration by the same state only inasmuch as she yields to the illegitimate satisfaction of male lust, that is, becomes a prostitute. The police supervision and control of enlisted prostitutes does not include the men who mingle with the prostitutes, which ought to be a matter of course if the medical surveillance were to be partly effective at least, quite disregarding the fact that justice demands that the law should be equally applied to both sexes. This protection of the man from the woman by the state overturns the nature of conditions. It appears as if men were the weaker and women the stronger sex, as if women were the seducer and poor weak man the seduced. Deutsche Vierteljahrschrift für öffentliche Gesundheitspflege, German Quarterly Journal for Public Health, No. 1, 1888, 121 to 136. As a demonstration of the continuity of our positions, we present here an excerpt from an article published in Rassegna Comunista, a magazine of the Communist Party of Italy, in 1921, under the title Combating Prostitution. The article was written by a communist, Alexandra Kollontai, and does nothing but bring back the Bolshevik Party's position on obvious prostitution and, above all, to expose prostitution that hides behind the moral marriage. Communists have never accepted the contrast between the depiction of the prostitute as immoral and that of the faithful and exemplary bride as moral, modern vested virgin of the domestic hearth. One prostitutes oneself whenever, through the concession of one's own body, one tries to escape from social duties, from the fatigue of work for the community. Therefore, the dictatorship of the proletariat, led by the Communist Party, is leading the fight against prostitution. but not through the imposition, exclusively bourgeois, of the Holy Crusade against those women who have had the only misfortune of not finding a permanent buyer, but by calling on all the forces suitable for common work, for active inclusion in the social organization. It is no coincidence that one of the points of the Soviet Constitution after the conquest of power in Russia stated with extreme simplicity, "Those who do not work do not eat," an elementary discriminant, unknown to previous societies, to establish the morality or immorality of an individual in front of the workers' republic, regardless of their social position and their gender. And what, after all, is the professional prostitute? She is a person whose energy is not used for the collective, a person who lives off others. From the point of view of the national economy, the professional prostitute is a labor deserter. For this reason, we must ruthlessly oppose prostitution. In the interests of the economy, we must start an immediate fight to reduce the number of prostitutes and eliminate prostitution in all its forms. We do not, therefore, condemn prostitution and fight against it as a special category, but as an aspect of labor desertion. To us in the Workers' Republic, it is not important whether a woman sells herself to one man or to many, whether she is classed as a professional prostitute selling her favors to a succession of clients, or as a wife selling herself to her husband. All women who avoid work and do not take part in production or in caring for children are liable, on the same basis as prostitutes, to be forced to work. We cannot make a difference between a prostitute and a lawful wife kept by her husband, whoever her husband is, even if he is a commissar. Alexandra Kollontai, Prostitution and Ways of Fighting It, in Selected Writings of Alexandra Kollontai, Lawrence Hill, 1978, 266-267. 2. Birth and Death of the Family. The Bourgeois Family. Alexandra Kollontai, writing in 1909, The Social Basis of the Woman Question, analyzed the bourgeois family thusly. In the era where the Third Estate was just beginning to fulfill its great mission, the accumulation of fabulous wealth within the family, the solidity and stability of family forms were one of the conditions for the success of the bourgeoisie in the struggle for existence with other strata of the population. Not without reason, the bourgeoisie of the 17th and 18th centuries glorified their morality and, pleased with it, opposed their family virtues to the customs of a depraved and frivolous nobility that had not understood the great secret of capitalist accumulation and considered the family not as the guardian but as the squanderer of accumulated wealth. In order to strengthen the solidity of the family, to raise the prestige of its family virtues higher up, the Third Estate has brought in religion, which preaches the indissolubility of the sacrament of marriage, the law that punishes the adultery of the wife, the morality that exalts the sacred character of the domestic hearth. When the bourgeoisie had gained a hegemonic social position, when all the threads of world production were brought together in its hands, its morals, its rules of conduct, and its civil codes, which had the precise aim of protecting its class interests, gradually became the compulsory law also for the other strata of the population. The morals of the Third Estate were recognized as the morals of all humanity. Strictly material and class interests forced the bourgeoisie to worry about the purity of the wedding bed and to hunt down the illegitimate children, that is, those who could not and should not inherit even a fragment of the treasures accumulated by the family. These material interests contribute to the consolidation of the rule of double morality and the establishment of strict legal provisions in the field of family law. And now, all of us, brought up on artificial norms of sexual morality, who are exceptionally committed to protecting the interests of the bourgeoisie, we still adore these class principles, like the highest ideological categories. We are ready to recognize them as normative principles of morality. At the same time, with the proclamation of capitalist mode of production as the timeless, eternal form of economic life of mankind, monogamous marriage was recognized as an inexorable and permanent social institution. The evolutionary point of view on marriage was persecuted and condemned with the same fury and hatred that was put in challenging and denying evolutionism in the economic life of society. Property and the family are too closely linked. If one of these pillars of the bourgeois world has been shaken, the solidity of the other becomes uncertain. For this reason, the bourgeoisie has always defended its family principles with great care. In order for any form of social interaction between people to be sustainable, it requires the presence of economic phenomena, which time caused this rather than another form of social interrelation. At the time when subsistence farming dominated, the family was first and foremost an economic cell, producing all the goods indispensable to the group of people who comprised it. As the economy of exchange developed and strengthened, the members of the family were increasingly able to meet their needs without the help of the family as an economic cell. Nevertheless, until the 19th century, i.e., the dawn of large-scale capitalist production, the family retained a whole series of small economic functions, which constitute the decisive and defining material element in the morals of the marriage union. As long as a productive value resided in the family, to a greater or lesser extent, its social existence was assured. Powerful vital ties united its members more solidly than the strictest laws and the most coercive moral norms could do. But from the moment when large-scale capitalist production took the family's economic prerogatives out of its hands, the family lost its value as a necessary economic cell and at the same time was condemned to a slow but inexorable disintegration. Indeed, where are the strong economic ties that once made a family so stable and vital? Let us first take the bourgeois family and see the functions depending upon it during long centuries have survived in the bosom of the bourgeoisie family to this day. The productive activity of the family, in the sense of the production of the long list of basic necessities, is reduced to a minimum. The domestic sphere is narrowed down to the point of becoming unrecognizable. Where would you find a bourgeois family today who make their own candles, soap, and beer, thread and fabric, store products for the winter, bake bread, sew clothes for the whole household? There is no need or profit to consume the strengths of family members to produce or fabricate objects, even if they are basic necessities, that can be produced cheaply in any shop. One after the other, the branches of production have escaped from the domestic economy to become objects of industrial speculation. If the manufacture and production of everyday objects has ceased within the family, has the family retained other economic functions? Because, after all, over the many centuries of its existence, the family has not only been an independent creator of wealth, but also its faithful guardian. The home and all the goods in it, the family treasure. Everything was protected and preserved devoutly by the family. Sedentary, attached to the property, land, and home, the family of the recent past was the most reliable apparatus for saving family riches, and with such things in place, the richness of the family bonded with the property interests of the family in the closest way. Divide the family, and the family treasures will be dispersed and dissipated. Not so today. Banks and other savings institutions fully take over the savings functions of the family. It is they, rather than the moral sexual unions, who take on the task of keeping the family's accumulated wealth and saving it. Moreover, these riches are increasingly taking the form of bearer bonds, which in no way require any special assignment from family members. With the ever-increasing mobility of life, with the development of communications, which allow the family to move more and more frequently, bulky property becomes a burden. In these conditions, the only form of wealth that is not costly is money and securities. This is how the old usual function of the family, the preservation of accumulated family wealth, escapes the circle of family obligations. But is consumption, this indispensable condition of family life, practiced to the same extent as it was with the past within the hearth? The home has given way to restaurants, clubs, furnished houses, and hotels. The upper middle class spends half their lives strolling through elegant resorts and enjoying the services of the Hôtel Palais. The moyen and petit bourgeois, in order to get rid of boring family responsibilities and reduce domestic expenses, live in furnished houses, eat in restaurants. They work in libraries and public lavatories, in museums and national galleries. As the growing demand for cheap labor in all fields attracts women out of their family cells and into the river of the working population, this kind of life is becoming more and more widespread. Today, in the petit and moyen bourgeoisie, the woman, thanks to her salary, more and more often covers a part of the domestic needs. The dependence of the wife on her husband and/or the daughter on her father is destroyed at the root, and, one after the other, the powerful ties that the members of the bourgeois family once formed between them are broken. What remains of the family today? What functions does it still possess? What continues to bind its members together? Perhaps raising children? But where are the bourgeois fathers and mothers who are engaged in the upbringing and education of their offspring? Not only the petit and moyen bourgeoisie, but also the upper middle class, no longer disdain public educational institutions. Kindergartens and elementary schools are becoming more widespread than ever before, not to mention secondary and higher education institutions. The function of education, just like the other roles of the family, are transferred from the family cell to society and the state. What then still remains of the family? What is the function of the family in the modern individualistic class structure of society? Its exclusive task is the direct transmission of the family patrimony. The difficult dissolution of modern marriage has the goal of contributing to the fulfillment of this single task of the present family, a family that serves not the moral needs of the individual, but the interests of property. Does the whole history of modern marriage not show us that this institution was caused by purely utilitarian calculations, and only in rare, especially benevolent cases did it have a moral element of attachment? It should be remembered that the laws of all states obstruct with all means the dissolution of marriages, and in this way, forcibly preventing dissolution of useful alliances, such as marriages of large fortunes with titles of nobility, or of land with capital. Alexandra Kollontai. Socjalnie osnowie żeńskiego woprosa. Social Foundations of the Woman Question. Znanie, 1909, 115 to 123. How does the destruction of the family and other social strata occur? Kollontai makes an extensive analysis of the disintegration of the peasant family, taking the example of retrograde Russia, which we do not report in full as it is a phenomenon already taken to the extreme consequences, nowadays, by capitalism itself. It is enough to see the numerical change between the city and the countryside as a result of the proletarianization of the peasant population that, if anything, remains in the country in the form of paid labor. Let us mention only a few facts concerning the exodus of peasant women from the patriarchal family as the beginning of their process of emancipation from family slavery. The passage of the large family clan, where the only will is that of the head of the family, to the nuclear family, where the work of women can be measured and where women have greater freedom of action and the possibility of obtaining an independent household. The consistent multiplication of female monastic vows evidence that the discontent of women in the peasant class grows with the evolution of family forms. The introduction of peasant women into seasonal jobs often forced to change provinces to earn a wage. She is already a new type of peasant woman, whose psychology is more reminiscent of that of the factory worker than that of the submissive peasant woman, who meekly takes on all the hardships of home life consecrated by the traditions of patriarchal life. Slowly but surely, a series of profound changes take place in the peasant family, which destroys its centuries-old stability. Ibid. 127 to 128. The reality of the proletarian family. In the same work, Kollontai examines the proletarian family. The most numerous layer of the modern society remains the class of proletarians. What is the status of the family in this class of population? Won't we at least find here the conditions that promise vitality to the current family structure? Can we, however, seriously ask such a question? Where is this family for a modern worker, for a seller of labor power? As soon as the light dawns, husband and wife both rush to leave their cramped, wretched home to obediently answer the call of the factory whistle and dutifully surrender to the power of the soulless but omnipotent Lord, the machine. Husband and wife stay out of the house until late in the evening. The children are entrusted to the care of the Lord God. At best they are cared for by an unemployed or disabled neighbor. The street, the noisy, dirty, debauched street. Here is their educator. Here is the first school of the children of the proletarians. If the factory is far from the house, the parents, at lunchtime, do not have time to go and have a look at their abandoned home. The tenants, men and women, the sick, the alcoholic, the old and the children, all the intruders and strangers destroy the last illusion of family isolation. The misery, obsessive knocks on the window and spy with greedy eyes on the sudden misfortune. Illness, unemployment, death of a family member, birth of a child. To stick its claws into the proletarian family, to tear it apart and disperse it somewhere. In such conditions, marriage, even if it is the result of mutual inclination, soon turns into an intolerable yoke that everyone tries to forget in vodka. The low salary of the husband, the continuing demand from the capital for cheap female hands push his wife into the great open arms of capitalist production. For from the moment the big doors of the factory closed on the working woman, the fate of the proletarian family was decided. Slowly but surely the life of the worker goes towards ruin. The hearth goes out and ceases to be the center of union for the family members. What a mockery, what a blasphemy in all those sentimental exclamations of the bourgeoisie on the sacred character of the domestic hearth and of motherhood, when millions, tens of millions of mothers are not even able to fulfill their most basic obligations. To the imperative appeal of capital, mothers snatch from their wombs their children, who still do not distinguish between day and night, and meekly go to knock on the doors of the factory. The bourgeois defenders of marriage and motherhood know perfectly well how in the very belly of the mother the children are deformed or crippled by emanations and harmful gases, how millions of children die from having absorbed toxic substances together with breast milk. But the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie has no limits. How important can it be for it that the children of the workers employed in the factories of matches or mercury, in the glassworks or in the white factories of Cerusa, are born with a deformed skeleton, a weak vital activity, or are born to die in the midst of painful convulsions? How important can it be for it that abortions or stillborn children are the inexorable result of the revolting system of exploitation of women in industry? How important can it be that, driven by the fury of hunger and misery, mothers get rid of their children with clandestine abortions? That statistics reveal the continuous growth of abortions, and that among these criminal mothers, there are not only girls left by their intended, but also legitimate wives of proletarians, respectable mothers of families. Ibid. 45-47. Bebel has this to say on the subject. Among the lower classes, mercenary marriage is practically unknown. The working man generally marries for love, but nevertheless many harmful and destructive influences exist in the proletarian marriage also. Blessed with many children, cares and worries ensue, and all too often bitter poverty prevails. Disease and death are frequent guests in the proletarian family, and unemployment heightens the misery. Many are the factors that lessen the working man's income and frequently deprive him of that meager income altogether. Hard times and industrial crises throw him out of employment. The introduction of new machinery or of new methods of production makes him superfluous. Wars, unfavorable tariff and commercial treaties, the imposition of new indirect taxes, or blacklisting by his employers as a result of his political convictions, destroy his means of subsistence or gravely injure them. From time to time, one or another thing occurs that entails a longer or shorter period of unemployment with its accompanying misery and starvation. Uncertainty is the mark of his existence. Such vicissitudes are productive of ill temper and bitter feelings that most frequently lead to outbursts in domestic life where demands are made daily and hourly that cannot be satisfied. This leads to quarrels and harsh words, and eventually to a rupture in the marriage relation. Fear of poverty and doubts as to whether it will be possible to bring up the children suitable to their station in life cause many women of classes to commit deeds that are averse to the laws of nature and to the laws of organized society as well. Such deeds include the various methods to prevent conception, and when this has occurred nevertheless, artificial abortion. Babel, 125, 135. We wanted to bring back the long quotations on the situation of the proletarian family, not only because we believe them to be current for thousands of proletarians and sub-proletarians throughout the world, but also because, if we do not have a static view of the situation, these conditions will tend to generalize also in the civil countries, with the worsening of the economic crisis that will throw millions of workers into unemployment, and even more so in the event of a future imperialist war with which the bourgeoisie will try to resolve the critical situation determined by itself. But even without pushing ourselves into the future, we can cite some of the many examples that show how the analysis of Bebel a century ago and of Alexandre Kollontai, who some lazy conservative might believe limited to the backward Russian situation, are not overcome at all. We can even stay at the Little Italy and neighboring countries to have enough examples. Naples, with its thousands of children trying to make ends meet, exploited and beaten by parents more desperate than them, forced into a sub-proletarian existence by the excess of decadent capitalism. The sale of children widespread in the South, or rather, not really a sale, but a tragedy of thousands of underprivileged families who try to place their children in couples of small bourgeois, sterile so as not to see them die of hunger. The cancer factories, where the proletarians, men and women, get sick with serious damage, even of offspring. Seveso, where already hundreds of children have been born deformed, not only because of the thirst for profit that has softened the land, but also because of the old bourgeois hypocrisy, as Kollontai says, that treats proletarian mothers as criminals because they do not want to accept the despair of deformed children, drama highly exacerbated by their precarious economic conditions. In Switzerland, immigrant parents are prevented from bringing their children with them, threatened with extradition, and there are many cases of parents who, unable to separate themselves from their children, keep them clandestinely, while thousands of children are abandoned to their country of origin without a home hearth, entrusted to old, sick relatives now unfit for work. This is the desperate situation of thousands of proletarian families today, even within our natural borders. Of course, there is also, at least for now, the aristocratic worker who neither sells nor exploits his children, who perhaps makes him study at university, even if this costs him in many cases extraordinary shifts and the impossibility of seeing for days his family. But even here for nothing is resolved the situation of the woman linked to the slavery of domestic work, as well as that of the master. On the contrary, the more in this type of family is accumulated a growing sordidness and selfishness. The objective of this family leads, in the flourishing moments of capitalism, to the exasperated defense of the four domestic walls, where the super-individualist petty bourgeois ideology dominates. The position of the communist left in this regard is clear, as exemplified in this quotation from Il Programma Comunista, April 29th to May 12th, 1960. Capitalism has destroyed monogamous marriage. Even if this institution formally survives, its historical base gradually crumbles. Women's work has now shown that, except for the transient impediments associated with motherhood, women can successfully replace men in any activity. One time was believed that only war was denied, but today this extreme limitation has also fallen. Just as a man, the woman has learned not only to produce economic goods, but also to slaughter her fellow human beings. What more do we want? In the family, or rather in the modern family in which the wife brings home a wage, or a salary, all the selfish degeneration of human nature is perpetuated. The family is the fortress within which man entrenches himself against his fellow human beings. The justification for all the baseness, the abuses, the cowardice that man carries out against his fellow human beings. For the family, man turns into a rapacious beast, but the prey he takes home triumphant has been torn from the mouth of his fellow man. And in this the man descends below the level of the beasts. The eagle that goes out to hunt does not carry to the nest the corpse of an eaglet, nor do wolf cubs eat wolf meat. But the bourgeois moral law exempts me from the obligation to contribute to the nutrition and breeding of your children. Indeed, since these do not belong to me, that is, they are not a part of my family, I can without remorse starve your children, if that allows me not to feed the mine, but rather to procure them the surplus. Such is the moral law that governs the bourgeois family. La dissoluzione della morale sessuale borghese è opera dello stesso capitalismo. Homeland and family, cornerstones of social squandering. To close this chapter on the family in capitalist society, which tends to show that no type of family is to be saved or taken as a model for future society, therefore we advocate no reform of the family, but rather its total destruction, like the bourgeois state, we want to highlight another aspect, not the last, rather parallel with the negativity of this clumsy structure that makes it a serious and incurable contradiction of capitalism itself. The waste of enormous productive capacities that the narrow domestic economy takes away from the community, from social production. The thousand monotonous daily operations that require intelligence, physical effort, spirit of adaptation, etc., that, however, each family nucleus, and particularly the angels of the hearth, dedicate only to their children, to their dishes, to their clothes, etc. Here, then, is another confirmation taken from Il Programma Comunista in an article entitled Homeland and Family, Cornerstones of Social Waste. Engels moves on to today's household. He writes, if we consider the house, the sanctum sanctorum of the rich, and by now we add of every Philistine from the middle class, duly colocized by the boorishness in which the press, radio, television collaborate, is it not a foolish waste of labor forces to occupy so many people to serve a single individual whose only occupations consist of idleness? What is the point of that great number of servants, cooks, lackeys, valets, coachmen, servants, gardeners, etc.? They do nothing but labors that have their origin in the isolation of every man within his four walls. Today it is obvious that the banal objection that bourgeois society would have freed itself from the exorbitant parasitism of this personal service, indeed the average boor would be reduced to crying over it, when, after the lavish dinners, he washed the dishes together with the guests, going to the kitchen. But in fact, the servile functions in the social magma, if they have in a certain sense changed the humiliating label, have certainly not improved their usefulness, and the forms they have taken are no longer useful, nor less ignoble in substance. At this point, our maestro Engels believes he has already demonstrated that in our rationalized organization, the individual working time in force today can be already and immediately reduced by half, just by using the labor force that today is not used at all or badly. This is 1845, let us remember. But Engels believes that we are not yet at the most important point, and moves on to that of the destruction of the family home. It is the association substituted to the individual, not only in the life of production, but in that of consumption, even for now only of material consumption. Engels refers here to the proposals of the contemporary English socialist Robert Owen, a utopian, let us say today, without detracting from the esteem Marx had for him. But if we don't spend words about the schematic ideas that Owen began to implement in New Lanark in his communist factories, which Engels describes to be intelligible at that time, such as the square building of 1,650 feet to the side, about 500 meters, and containing a large garden, capable of accommodating from 2,000 to 3,000 people, that may well be understood as a better project than much of the latest hypocritical urbanism, especially the Italian Iene Casa that on almost 25 hectares would house more than 10,000 people. The critical part of the step is completely decisive. 120 years ago, it was visionary to have central heating. Just think that in the traditionalist England, even in 1962, there were vituperations against projects that did not include a wood fireplace in every bedroom of the big bourgeoisie. The smaller, the more hypocritical. The brilliant Owen calculated all these immediately achievable economies. What Engels shows with Owen's minute accounts is the enormous volume of wasted time and effort involved in shredding humanity into molecular family cells, the economic effects of which are, however, less harmful than the social and political ones, as it is there the real limit that chops the wings of the birth of the new social man, unable to show solidarity with his fellow man under the idiotic pretext that he has love for himself and for his minimum family circle, a pretext that every day is reduced to an exaggerated lie. Under the reactionary and rhetorical praise of this type of family society, now rotten for millennia, hides one of the most despicable forms of slavery, that of housewives from which come out by equally degenerative, unnatural ways the nations rich in the American style, and the poorest where the women of the working class bear 200 burdens on their poor shoulders of the so-called weaker sex by the hypocrisy of the well-meaning. Like Owen, Engels mocks the waste of time in making the same provisions in 2,000 parcels by the baker and the butcher. But the modern man, dumbfounded by 2 centuries of capitalism, believes, convinced on the faith of television or the movies, that shopping is the supreme pleasure of human life. And the freed Russian women freeze in unbearable queues. Utopianism pits a tabletop model of future society against the current one. Marxism proceeds to the analysis of the capitalist economy as a product of history and condemned to an increase in the productive forces of humanity, to its current corruption, to the ever-increasing squandering, to the certainty of the forms that the new society will take by destroying it. January 18th, 1962. Therefore, in bourgeois society, everything is ruin and dehumanization. The only embryo of the future society is in the revolutionary class struggle, in the revolutionary union of the proletariat, men and women, in the solidarity between the exploited, in the Communist Party.